of unlikely romance evolved between a cosmologist named Marianne and a beekeeper named Roland. And throughout the play, our cosmologist Marianne talks passionately about things like quantum mechanics, string theory, and most interestingly, multiverse theory. And eventually, at some point, our young beekeeper, Roland, has a revelation and states the following, that in the quantum multiverse, every choice, every decision you've ever and never made exists in an unimaginably vast ensemble of parallel universes. Now, this play, of course, is fictional. Maybe it's a bit hyperbolic, but today I wanted to discuss why I think that Roland's ideas about the multiverse is not. And it seems to me that this multiverse not only characterizes reality, but also the very tool that we use to understand this reality, which is science. And I think that we can use this idea of a multiverse to understand this big team science movement and understand it as an attempt to explore and understand the science multiverse. So first, I'm going to sort of explain this multiverse framework that I've been conceptualizing efforts like the Psychological Science Accelerator in for the couple of years now. So as an example, let's imagine a typical study in psychology. And let's keep in mind, of course, that not all studies will look like this, but hopefully it'll serve as a useful example. So let's say that we're working with Marianne, who's the cosmologist in that play that I previously described. And let's say Marianne is interested in testing a psychological theory. In typical psychology research, she would first derive some sort of hypothesis about how the world works. To test this hypothesis, she would design a study. She would then execute that study. Afterwards, she would process and analyze her data and then form some sort of conclusion. Now, if Marianne was a typical psychologist, she would possibly then write a paper about her conclusion, thinking that she has possibly discovered something reliably and psychologically interesting about the world. But if you remember from my description of the play, Marianne isn't a typical psychologist. She's actually quite familiar with this notion of a multiverse. And so she realizes that there were many predictions that she could have derived to test her theory of interest. And that for each one of those predictions, there are many studies she could have designed as tests. And for each one of those designs, there are many ways she could have actually executed the study. And for each one of those study executions, there are many different ways that she could have modeled and analyzed her data. And when we try to quantify something like this, we could very simply consider the size of Marianne's so-called science multiverse as the number of reasonable predictions she could have derived multiplied by the number of reasonable studies she could have designed, multiplied by the number of reasonable ways she could have executed the study, multiplied by the number of ways she could have reasonably analyzed her data. And if we assume, just for the sake of example, that there's only 5 reasonable ways that she could have done all of those things, the size of her science multiverse is 625. But Marianne only occupies one of those realities. And this raises an interesting question that I think psychologists are grappling with. Given the sheer size of this science multiverse, to what extent should we believe that our scientific conclusions about the world are reliable? And I think this is something that the big team science movement and the meta-science movement have been starting to chip away at. I think prior to this movement, there was this assumption that these conclusions were indeed quite reliable. But I want to sort of show how we could use this framework to understand how the big team science movement has been slowly chipping away at this assumption. And for the sake of time, I'm really just going to start with the design of studies. I have a lot of thoughts on prediction as well, but I'll start here. So in 2020, Landy and colleagues published a paper where they had 15 research groups to design a study to test the same exact research question. And one of these research questions was whether people explicitly self-report that they possess negative automatic associations with negatively stereotyped social groups. So this is a really interesting research question, and there's many reasonable ways that one may go about testing this question. And what they found is that the research groups took slightly different approaches. So one of the teams showed images of a negatively stereotyped social group in the US. And then they asked participants if they are personally aware of any immediate gut level reaction using a Likert type scale. Another team asked a dichotomous question about whether participants were aware of any personal automatic negative associations with ethnic minorities broadly defined. And another team asked a Likert scale question about whether participants believe that people in general can have unconscious negative automatic associations. At first glance, these all seem to be perfectly reasonable ways of trying to test the research question, and it may even appear to be sort of inconsequential which one we choose. But what Landy and colleagues did that was sort of interesting and novel is that they randomly assigned participants to complete one version of each of these studies. And this is what they found. I'm going to use a lot of graphs that sort of look like this, so I'm going to take a moment to explain it. We have Cohen's D on the x-axis, which is a standardized effect size. And in this context here, we can basically think of this 0 as being roughly equivalent to saying that participants neither agreed nor disagreed that they possess negative associations with ethnic outgroups. And when you look at their data, you see that some of the methods that research teams employed indicated that participants were quite aware of their negative automatic associations. But some of the other methods indicated that participants were quite unaware of their negative automatic associations. And if you look at these error bars here, this is indicating that both of these effect size estimates were statistically significant, but in completely opposite directions. And when you look at all of the data, you see just a lot of variability. And this is variability beyond what we would expect from sampling error alone. So for those of you who are sort of familiar with this meta-analytic framework that they're describing, they have something called the I-squared statistic, which is the amount of variability driven by something other than sampling error. And so an I-squared statistic that is this large suggests that variation in the design of the study substantially impacted the observed pattern of results. So what Landy and colleagues did was this really interesting big team science project that highlighted how variation in the design of studies can impact our scientific conclusions. Of course, there's also been a lot of efforts looking at how differences in study execution impact our conclusions. This is probably work that most people are familiar with by now, but I'll highlight this recent paper by Rick Klein and colleagues that I really like. In this paper, they took 28 research studies and had 62 teams run direct replications of the original study. So we're holding design constant now. And in the visualization of the results, we have the original effect size denoted with a little triangle, and then each one of the individual replications denoted with a tick mark. And so in this scenario here, we see that the original study found a large effect, and then the 62 replications yielded a distribution of effects that were centered approximately near 0. And of course, as you can see, some of these studies were positive, some of them were negative, distribution centers just a little bit to the right of 0. And in this scenario, it was mostly driven by sampling error. But if you look at these highlighted rows here, these were scenarios where the observed variability in the effect sizes exceeded what we would expect from sampling error alone. And so what this work is suggesting is that if we run the same exact study more than once, we often will introduce meaningful differences that change the pattern of results. And so I highlighted this because I think that we could once again go back to this multiverse framework and say, okay, what Rick Klein and colleagues were working on is examining the study execution part of the science multiverse while holding everything else constant. Now I want to briefly touch upon the data analysis part. And one really cool study, Silberzon and colleagues asked 29 research teams to evaluate whether dark-skinned players were more likely than light-skinned players to receive a red card in a soccer match. And so in this scenario, the 29 research teams were each given the same exact database without any specific instruction regarding how to analyze the data. And in the graph here, what we have on the y-axis is an odds ratio. And so these higher values are indicating that dark-skinned players are more likely than light-skinned players to receive a red card. And then over here, this suggests that they're equally likely, and then less likely down over here. And what we'll see is that they used a red mark to indicate a group's effect size estimate, and a red mark meant that it was statistically significant, and a gray mark meant that it was statistically not significant. And so in this scenario here, you can see that two research teams estimated a similar effect size, but one of them was not statistically significant. And I actually haven't looked at their data, but I suggest that this was, I believe that this was probably a linear mixed effects model, and they probably just used different random structures, but that's sort of a side point. If you look at all of their data, which is the main point I'm trying to make, you see that the results range from estimating that dark-skinned players were 11% less likely to receive a red card, all the way up to them being 293% more likely to receive a red card. And in 70% of these cases, the estimates were statistically significant. And this was a really impactful paper because it highlighted another part of the science multiverse, variability in how we analyze the same exact data set. I also want to highlight that there's a similar study that was recently conducted by Botvinnik, Netzer, and colleagues, who gave 70 teams the same data set to test a hypothesis regarding neural activity during decision-making under risk. And I highly recommend reading this paper carefully if you haven't run across it yet. But there's a few interesting things that I want to highlight. The first is that none of their teams chose identical data analysis workflows. And what they found is that you could sort of categorize these analysis strategies into clusters, depending on their probability of yielding a significant effect. And as you can sort of see, the hypothesized patterns of neural activation across these three clusters looked quite different. And the probability of yielding a significant finding varied about 25% depending on the analysis strategy. This isn't necessarily my field of research, so I can't really evaluate the technical aspects of their work, but one of their insights that really stuck with me was that their teams reported high confidence in their own results, and reported that they believed that the other teams would find similar results, yet we obviously have evidence to the contrary. And I thought this was interesting because it reminds me of that revelation of our young beekeeper, Roland, who at one point was constrained by the reality of his own universe, only to later realize that he was previously unaware of the vast ensemble of parallel universes. And I think this actually nicely corresponds to what we've been seeing in psychology, where we've long existed in this concept of a science multiverse, but only through these recent big team science and meta-scientific efforts are we actually becoming aware of it. And so that's sort of my pitch for why I think this multiverse framework can kind of usefully categorize things like the many analyst projects, the many labs projects, and I think that this can sort of be a cohesive narrative for what we're all working on. And I wanted to sort of highlight what it means for PSA, Psychological Science Accelerator. And I want to show how a few of the Psychological Science Accelerator's projects can also be usefully conceptualized in this framework. And I wanted to do so because showing this can not only help us make sense of the past, but also hopefully inspire us when we're deciding what studies to pursue in the future. We could usefully ask questions like, okay, this study will clearly examine whether we can execute the same study across multiple regions, but does it have a clear plan for looking at variability in the data analysis multiverse, and the operationalization of the constructs multiverse? And so that's sort of my goal when highlighting these PSA studies. And when I go into these examples, I think it's going to become pretty clear pretty quickly that I'm highlighting projects that I've played larger roles in. And I want to kind of let some of the other people in the PSA know that I'm not doing this because I think that the projects I've worked on are better. It's only because I'm more familiar with those projects. So if I don't mention your project today, please know that it's not because I think it's not superior. So I'll get started with one of my own studies that was conducted in partnership with the PSA. It's a project called the Many Smiles Collaboration, and I've seen that a few of the collaborators are here today. So thanks for being here today. So this Many Smiles Collaboration is a global adversarial team of researchers who came together to conduct foundational tests of the facial feedback hypothesis. And by foundational test, we meant, look at the theory and tell us how to best test it. So for those of you who are not aware, the facial feedback hypothesis is this simple idea that sensory motor feedback from facial expressions of emotion can impact emotional experience. And this is a seemingly very straightforward idea, but when we had researchers come together to make the actual predictions from the theories, we found that they were extracting different predictions from the same set of underlying theories. And so you'll see that I'm starting to use that multiverse framework to try to conceptualize what we are doing in this Many Smiles collaboration. To address those predictions, we essentially had to design 6 different studies, which we then combined into a really massive study design to look at generalizability across execution. We ran the study across 28 labs spanning 19 countries. And then we've analyzed data in multiple ways. I actually haven't quantified how many ways we've done it yet, but it's a lot of our code. So I just put N here for now. And then what we're trying to do is take all those predictions, all of those designs, all those executions, and all those analyses, and form a more robust conclusion about these facial feedback theories. And this is sort of just like the broad overview of the results, which are not necessarily important for the point I'm trying to make, but just in case anyone's interested, I will note that not all the predictions were confirmed. Some people made theory-driven predictions about facial feedback effects that we provided or found very little evidence in support of. We did find that results meaningfully differed across participants, but that between country variability was actually quite small. We found that results strongly differed across analysis strategies. Something as simple as whether to include a subset of participants could drastically change the amount of support for one of our predictions. And the overall conclusion that we found was that posing facial expressions of happiness could influence feelings of happiness, but that these effects are quite small and don't emerge in all scenarios. And so this is sort of how I have conceptualized what we did in the Many Smiles collaboration is through this sort of multiverse framework that I've been describing. And I think it's interesting because what we've done in this project has come away with a very nuanced understanding of facial feedback effects. And I think it's an understanding that's far more insightful than what we would have gained if we conducted science the traditional way. 10 years ago, these yellow highlighted cells might represent how we went about trying to study this thing. And you could see how this could lead to a replication crisis 10 years later when someone decides to use a slightly different analysis or slightly different design or execute it in a different country. Next, I'm going to jump to the first study conducted by the PSA, which was a global examination of the Bayless dominance model of social perception. I see that Lisa is here today. So Lisa, I really hope I don't mess up the description of this study. So this is my understanding of sort of the theoretical grounding for the work. It seems that it's sort of, at least at one point, was widely accepted that people quickly and involuntarily form impressions of others based in part on their facial appearances, and that there was this extremely popular theoretical model that posited that people spontaneously make these evaluations based on 2 judgments. Judgments of trustworthiness and judgments of dominance. And based on my read of the literature, it seems that it's often sort of been assumed that this theoretical model captures a universal psychological process, but that a limitation of the previous work was that it was developed and replicated with Western participant samples. And so one of the purposes of the first PSA project was to simply examine the generalizability of this theoretical model across world regions. And so when we try to conceptualize what we did in the multiverse framework, this is what it looks like. We used the same theory-derived prediction. We used a very similar design, but we ran the study and executed it in many ways. And in this scenario, that study was executed with approximately 12,000 participants from 41 countries that were sort of bent into 11 different world regions. And then there were two sort of major data analysis strategies, both of which informed the overall conclusion in the paper. And so in this project, it seems that it sort of started off with this very similar principal components analysis strategy that was used in the original study. And when this strategy was used, it looked like the theoretical model generalized quite well across the 11 world regions. But when an alternative data analysis strategy was used that improved upon some of the limitations of the original strategy, results revealed that the model did not replicate very well across world regions, and that the underlying structure of these social judgments appeared to vary across these world regions. And I think that this has interesting implications for the way that we think about this multiverse problem. Because if we limit the multiverse to just one data analysis strategy, what we see is that there's not a lot of evidence that these results are strongly differing across these level of executions, which in this scenario are world regions. But as soon as we switch to a second data analysis strategy, we do find that the results meaningfully differ across world regions. And this gets back to an earlier point, one of the earliest points I made when discussing this multiverse idea, which is that it's multiplicative. Variation, for example, in the participants sampled may not matter for one data analysis strategy, but may be quite consequential for another data analysis strategy. And similarly, you can imagine that there are certain study designs that may be highly replicable across world regions, but other study designs that may not. And so when I made this argument that the size of the multiverse is multiplicative, this actually provides some preliminary evidence of that multiplicative nature. The third study I'm going to review today, I'm actually going to sort of cut my description a bit short because I looked at the PSA booklet and saw that Charlie Dorison will actually be presenting the same work. So I don't want to steal his thunder. But the third study that I will very briefly highlight shows that this multiverse problem matters not just for theories, but also for the application of psychology to practice. And so as many of you know, the PSA recently conducted 3 global studies related to the application of psychology to the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of these studies that Charlie Dorison will be discussing later examined the effects of different ways of framing health information about COVID-19 on a variety of health-related outcomes. And so in his study, people were exposed to loss-framed health messages that emphasized negative consequences of non-adherence to health recommendations. Other participants were exposed to gain-framed messages that emphasized the positive consequences of adherence to these recommendations. Then there was a few outcomes that were looked at: behavioral intentions to engage in protective behaviors, support for public policies designed to protect against COVID-19, and the propensity to seek additional information about COVID-19. And this was interesting for a few reasons. One is that it allowed us to test competing hypotheses about the effects of message framing on these outcomes. And so predictions derived from the negativity bias literature suggested that loss framing should increase these 3 outcomes. Predictions derived from the framing literature suggested that loss framing should decrease these outcomes. And then I think Charlie will talk quite a bit about this 4th outcome that was measured, which is anxiety. And I won't show the results because, like I said, I don't want to steal his thunder, but I do want to highlight how this project could be conceptualized in the multiverse framework. So what we have is we start off with these 2 competing predictions about the effects of framing on these outcomes. And then what ended up being done in this project was that the study ended up being designed in multiple ways. And so when it comes to operationalizing what a loss-framed message is, there's a lot of reasonable ways that you could create a loss-framed message. And so in this study, we used multiple variants of a loss-framed message, multiple variants of a gain-framed message. And then, of course, in typical PSA style, we ran the study across 84 countries. And then one part that I hope Charlie will have time to highlight in his talk later in PSACON is that we ended up using 440 different data analysis strategies. And so this was one of the first, but definitely not the only studies in the Psychological Science Accelerator that sort of systematically used a really comprehensive multiverse analysis. And I don't want to steal Charlie's thunder, so unfortunately, I'm just going to have to like skip through a bunch of results that I promise are super interesting. So go attend Charlie's talk. But you just see lots of colorful figures. Charlie, feel free to steal from my slides if it's ever helpful. But yeah, multiverse. That's how I sort of have conceptualized this project that was done. Is that yeah, we had multiple predictions, multiple designs, multiple executions, and if I've been persuasive at all or clear so far, I think that it is hopefully clear why I believe that this multiverse framework can usefully characterize what's happening in this big team science movement. And I think it also helps articulate some of my priorities as director of the Psychological Science Accelerator. Because when I'm looking at studies that we're considering pursuing in the future, I think that we've often focused on variability in study execution. Normally, when it comes to recruiting multiple sites to run a study, we're examining cross-cultural variability in an effect. But what we haven't done as much of in a systematic and intentional way is examining some of this variability that could be derived by different people making different predictions, different people designing different studies, and different people analyzing the data in different ways. And we've incidentally done a lot of these things, as I've highlighted before. But I think that if we have a useful framework to guide our thinking, like this one that I'm presenting here, it helps us think about what sort of studies we should prioritize in the future. And I would propose that we prioritize studies that try to look at multiple aspects of the multiverse issue in a very intentional way. So those are my thoughts on how we can characterize what's happening in the big team science movement. But I wanted to spend the last 15 minutes or so talking about some of the challenges I think we're going to face in our pursuit to address these problems. And in doing so, I think I'm also just going to vent a lot about the problems that we've faced so far. So after we finished the first PSA study, I, Patrick Forscher, Chris Chartier, Jessica Flake, Lisa DeBrune, and Ben Jones wrote a commentary about our experience. And one of our first observations that we highlighted for the world is that the big team science that we're doing is a stress test on our institutional structures. And that our project, which was the first PSA project, revealed that there are many tiny cracks that can lead to floods of inefficiency. And this sort of shows us one of the important, but perhaps unintended goals of our movement, which is that as we engage in this work, we find that there are some problems. And we end up spending a lot of time chatting with science stakeholders about how there may be certain policies and infrastructures that are actually creating these massive barriers for our type of work. And so one of these barriers that I end up talking quite a bit about with journals themselves is their policies and their infrastructures. So when we submitted the first PSA study as a registered report to Nature Human Behavior, we needed to demonstrate that all research sites had ethics approval. But of course, in order to obtain ethics approval, we found that many researchers had ethics review boards that either wanted or needed a final version of the translated study materials. But if you've done a registered report, you know that your reviewers are going to ask you to change things. And so you might not want to translate the materials before the registered report. And so this creates sort of an impossible situation. Which one do you do first? And what you end up doing is sort of throwing up your hands and realizing that you're going to end up having to redo a lot of work unnecessarily. And in this scenario, this problem could be fixed with a relatively simple change to the journal policy. Allowing people to upload their ethics approval at the end of the registered report process could drastically reduce the amount of unnecessary redoing of work that happens in these projects. Similarly, one issue we spend quite a bit of time talking to journals about is different authorship requirements. So in the PSA, we endorse a contributorship-based model of authorship, which I'll talk about in a few slides. But in this contributorship-based model of authorship, what we're doing is acknowledging all types of contributions, not just the ones that were about conceptualizing the research idea or writing the actual paper. But there are still some journals that explicitly require that all co-authors make substantial contributions to writing. And so the PSA cannot submit papers to those journals unless they amend their policies. Because when you have 500 collaborators, it's neither feasible nor desirable to have all 500 of them make quote unquote substantial contributions to writing. Another journal infrastructure that we run into time and time again that I spend a lot of time talking to the journals about is their authorship information upload system. And so for any of you who have done that, if you submitted a paper, you realize that it's a real pain to even submit information for 5 authors. This pain becomes even worse when you start getting up to 500 authors. And we've definitely had many experiences where we're uploading information for 500 authors and then Nature Human Behavior's portal unexpectedly crashes. And we reopen it and see that we have 0 authors information uploaded. And so to address issues like this, what we end up doing in this big team science movement is working with the journals actively on infrastructure and policy reform that helps ensure that the science that we're trying to do can proceed more efficiently. And this was something that I wasn't aware of when I first sort of joined this movement. I thought that it was going to be more about doing the science rather than trying to change the world that we live in order to make the science easier. But I've come to learn that this is an equally important part of the quest to improve psychological science. Another issue that I think we've consistently run into is with ethics approval. So that first PSA study involved nearly 150 documentations of ethics approval. And this, once again, is challenging because ethics review processes are not designed for large distributed collaborations. And so what we found in that project was that the IRB forms and the IRB submission systems were completely unstandardized, which meant that collaborators ended up spending quite a bit of time reformatting our ethics applications so that they could sort of fit the idiosyncratic preferences at their own institution. And if we assume that this takes them an hour, which I think is a bit of an underestimate, but let's say it takes each of those researchers an hour. When you have 250 researchers on a project, that means that you've wasted 250 hours of researchers' time, which is over a week of combined effort. Then when you try to additionally factor in the time wasted by the people who actually serve on those ethics review boards, you sort of want to pull your hair out. It's a lot of research waste. One of the other things that we're seeing when we have these conversations with ethics review boards is that they're sort of a bit uncomfortable with these large distributed collaborations. There are some IRBs who sort of want to be considered this central IRB, sometimes even going as far as to ask other teams to submit IRB reliance agreements. Sometimes these IRBs want lists of every single collaborator involved, copies of their IRB approvals, consent documents, et cetera, ability to inspect their data. This is not useful for groups like this, the PSA. We simply do not have the time or resources to give a single IRB that much oversight. We don't normally have lists of every single collaborator involved at the beginning of the study. In fact, usually it's up until the very last moment of the study that I actually know everyone who was involved. And so what I think this ends up meaning is that individuals at universities with strong ethics review oversight are less likely to participate in the big team science movement. Because if you want to lead a PSA study and your IRB says that they want you to submit evidence that every single one of your collaborators has engaged in some sort of ethics training, even if it's not even required by law in their country, you end up creating a massive administrative hurdle that many researchers will simply prefer to just jump over, or not jump over, but rather just avoid. And maybe they go back to doing smaller team science. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts about IRB. You might be able to sense the frustration in my voice, so I'll move on to press release. I found that press offices really love our work. It's really exciting stuff, but they don't love the idea of hundreds of similar press releases coming out from each one of our institutions. And in the past, I feel like this has meant that there's been a bit of a struggle, a bit of a negotiation going on between different press release offices. And what I've seen happen in the past is that only a few key members of each collaboration get to submit their press release. and get to speak with the media. And this is problematic in my opinion. If you actually look at the media coverage of studies done in the Psychological Science Accelerator, you'll see that they tend to interview and feature a select group of researchers, despite the fact that our projects require the efforts of many. And I think this is in part due to the fact that press release offices want to dominate want to sort of own the story. And so if only a handful of press release offices are releasing a story, they're going to list the people at their institution as the people to contact. And it means that the entire collaboration isn't being represented when people in the media come to discuss our work with us. And so I think this is going to require some shifts in the way that researchers, press offices, and reporters interact. And for those of you who are signing up for some of the newer PSA studies, you'll notice that there's been a shift in our collaboration agreement where we now explicitly acknowledge this issue and make it clear that if you're going to speak to the media, that you need to acknowledge that this was a contribution of many people and recommend that the reporters get in touch with some of those people. Okay, last one that I wanted to sort of talk about in this category of institutional barriers is hiring and subcontracting. So this continues to be a very massive problem for groups like the Psychological Science Accelerator. In a recent, multi-million-dollar grant that I had submitted, we ended up spending days talking to a university finance team about how we could distribute funds in order to compensate PSA labor to send out data collection grants and support key services like web hosting. And there have been times where I've had these conversations with finance offices, and their frank answer has been that the benefits of sending $200 to a lab in Kenya are far outweighed by the mountain of paperwork that it would require for them. And that's extremely problematic for our model of science. So we're constantly working on finding ways to make this easier, but it's currently a barrier that slows us down. And the grant that I'm describing, luckily we had a finance office that was willing to be very creative and came up with some really interesting solutions that, if we get the grant, will hopefully make the process much smoother than it's been in the past. Okay, I'm going to move on to one of the other barriers that I'm quite passionate about, which is incentivizing skilled but less visible contributions. So Immanuel Kant once said that all crafts, trades, and arts have profited from the division of labor. And he went on to add that in scenarios where everyone is a jack of all trades, the craft remains at an utterly primitive level. Now, I think this very well characterizes how we do science. We have a lot of jack of all trades as far as being experts in not only the theories, but also the models and the design of the studies. And I think that the limitations of the jack of all trades approach is particularly apparent when we do this big team science. And there have been many notable moments in the PSA when we've realized that we're working on things that only a very select group of researchers actually know how to do. And so we're constantly finding that not many people have really been trained to do international research projects, to be able to manage those projects. And for those small group of people who have, there's often this feeling that we could actually be way more effective at managing these massive international research projects if we could actually focus some of our attention on perfecting our project management skill sets. So as some of you know, I've actually engaged in some formal project management training because at some point in the first PSA study, I said, wow, this is really hard. Certainly someone has figured out a better way of doing this. I'm going to try to seek some training. But I was fortunate to have the opportunity to do that. And if we could have more people focusing their efforts on specific tasks that they're really interested in pursuing, I think that we could actually improve our workflow a little bit. Similarly, not many people know how to conduct the sometimes very expansive power simulations that journals like Nature Human Behavior require in a registered report. So in our PSA COVID studies, Patrick Forscher and Hannah Monschatz literally had to use a supercomputer to complete the power simulations. And of course, we had very little experience actually sort of interfacing with those sort of high computing machines. And so that ended up being logistically challenging and required a lot of very unique expertise. On the Many Smiles collaboration project I described earlier, many of our analyses just literally crashed our computers, which I'd never seen before. I'd never seen R just sort of running, and then just boom, my computer is shut off, and whatever I was working on is gone. But that happened quite often in that project. And what we found is that we were just trying to fit models that were far more complex than R was built to fit. And so what we ended up having to do was take time and delay the project for about a month while our team of statisticians sort of just stopped and said, okay, let's learn this new program called Julia, which is a high performance coding language, because that's the only way we'll actually be able to tweak these models. And then once we've tweaked them and figured out what we want to do, maybe then we can bring it back into R. And so that was a really interesting experience that, just showed that if we could have people who are sort of dedicated to the sort of process of doing statistics for big team science, that we could probably move a little bit more efficiently. We wouldn't have lost a month trying to learn this new program if we would have had someone who's been thinking about this for a long time. And by the way, if you're really interested in Julia, it is an amazing program. If you thought that the documentation in R was bad though, you're in for a very rude awakening with Julia. The output and error messages is sometimes complete nonsense. But the models that were taking me 24 hours to fit in R, I was able to fit in Julia in literally like 2 minutes. So it's if you're working on some really slow things in R, it might be worth checking out Julia in the future. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it offline. Okay, so we know that we need this skilled sort of focused labor, and that some of those contributions can be less incentivized in our field. And so I wanted to point people's attention to this really great report by the Academy of Medical Sciences. It's a little old by now, but the lessons still ring true. And one of the insights in this report was that the main barrier that they identified when it came to participating in big team science, which for them was really focused on interdisciplinary efforts, is the lack of recognition and assigned value to one's contributions. And so people feared that if they, for instance, did a lot of heavy lifting on something like data processing and data management, that this wouldn't be useful for their career. And this is very problematic for what we're trying to do, because as I hopefully just made the case for, we need specialists. We need people who are specialized in the art of managing large international collaborations. We need people who are specialized in data management practices. And so the first step to addressing this problem, I believe, is documentation, using things like the credit taxonomy to be able to document what people actually did on the project. And these are some really fun badges that can show what people did on their project. This is a badge system created by Firefox people, if you're interested. The project's not deprecated, but I definitely want to sort of keep it alive because it's really cool. So the first step is documentation, but of course, as the Academy of Medical Sciences group pointed out, the second important step is establishing the value of these contributions, and that's a more difficult problem that I think we need to work on. And it's part of this ongoing debate with these people who are developing things like the credit taxonomy that acknowledge these individual contributions, and it's debates that they're having with publishing groups and with the field as well. And I wanted to let everyone know that if you're in this big team science movement for the long haul, that this debate is important for us as well, and that we also have to focus on this, because if we go back to a pure authorship-based model where everyone has to contribute to the writing of the paper, our projects are going to be very slowed down. And if we can't find a way of recognizing that people played really large roles in things like project management, our projects, we will not be able to actually recruit people who are highly skilled to fill those very important roles. Okay, so yeah, if you're interested in joining this fight, send me a message. I spend a lot of time arguing with people about why we need to use things like the credit taxonomy, and also talking about some of the limitations of the credit taxonomy, which I'm happy to talk about at some other point as well. Okay. Obtaining and managing necessary resources. Anyone who has had even a 2-minute conversation with Patrick Forscher has probably heard him spend 5 of those 2 minutes talking about funding problems in the PSA. And so there's really great blog posts that him and Hans Eiserman wrote. I recommend just reading that blog post because it's far more useful than anything I'm going to say today. But I will note that the Academy of Medical Sciences also acknowledged that funding opportunities is a really big problem for these large scale projects. And so sorry, Patrick, sorry, Hans, they beat you to that conclusion. And what we're finding is that government funding agencies in particular, especially in the US, don't really quite know what to do with proposals from groups like the PSA. It's sort of unusual to fund a global network of researchers who have a broad research agenda, as opposed to a small group of collaborators with a more narrow agenda. And I wanted to kind of note that like some people hate the funders for it, but I want to kind of point out that they've been burned before for this sort of stuff. And so some of you might be familiar with the National Children's Study, $1.3 billion scientific project, went on for over a decade and didn't even come close to delivering on the promises that were made. You know, that was really embarrassing for the National Institute of Health, which ended up, you know, funding and ultimately gutting this project. And there's this really cool documentary. I'm actually trying to get a copy of it so that we could do a PSA screener, so that we all can kind of watch it. But there's this documentary that's following the implosion of a €1 billion brain project, and also super interesting based on what I've read about it so far. So you know, we could see why funders might be reluctant to give us a $1.3 billion budget after being burned by projects like this. This, of course, can create sort of a catch-22 for us. We can't really build the organization in a meaningful way unless we have funding, but funders might be reluctant to give that money to us until we've proven that our organization actually runs effectively. By the way, here's the link to the blog post by Patrick and Hans. But I do want to say I have some optimism. I think people are beginning to notice the value of our hard work. We've actually received small amounts of project-specific funding for PSA projects like PSA005, the PSA COVID projects, Many Smiles collaboration. Just Flake has also received some funding for some measurement work in the PSA. We received very small sums of money. I can't emphasize enough how small these sums are, money from conferences and donations. And so you all here today could fix that problem. If you have like a billionaire friend, we could just donate $1 billion to the PSA and then we don't have to have this slide anymore. Of course, we've had researchers who have been fortunate enough to dedicate their effort to the PSA through institution-specific funding. So for those of you who don't know, I work at Stanford University, right? I don't technically work at the Psychological Science Accelerator, but my employer sort of is cool with me just dedicating all of my time and effort to the Psychological Science Accelerator. Patrick Forscher had a similar setup. Savannah has a similar setup. Bastien Paris had a similar setup. And I think most people in the PSA have a similar setup where their employers, usually universities, say like, yeah, this is sort of cool. You should continue working on this big team science stuff. And then sort of as this little blue part over here is maybe kind of foreshadowing, Charlie Ebersole and Chris Chartier recently received about a $1 million grant from the John Templeton Foundation for a themed PSA call for studies. This is really exciting news, right? I think that it's sort of the first really big break for the PSA. And of course, the funding is going to Ashland University, but it's the first time that there's been funding specifically for PSA activity. Well, I should say first time that there's funding of a large magnitude for PSA study work. And so that's really exciting. I'll also just note for those who are social psychologists, we've recently been recognized by SPSP in sort of like a broader impacts award that they'll be giving in a few months. So, you know, some of the scientific groups are starting to recognize the importance of what we're working on as well. And so I suspect that we're going to be hearing a lot of good news like this in the future. And it's all because we've spent years toiling away at a really hard job, despite having very little funding. Okay, I'm running out of time. So getting organized, and I'll stop here. It's really hard to know who is doing what in the PSA. It's really hard to know how we're supposed to complete a specific task, where we can find certain things. And just as a brief anecdote, before I was director, I was on several PSA committees. I've been with the PSA since basically day one. I still really never had a clear idea of who was working on what, how we should complete a task, where I should go for something. And so one of the big tasks that I think we're working on in the near future is trying to get organized. Aaron Buchanan has a great idea to leverage an online learning management system called Canvas. This is a game changer in my opinion. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it in the future. I've been spending a lot of time actually trying to figure out the structure of the PSA and figure out who should be communicating with who, and how frequently they should be communicating. I'll post a link to this in a PSA channel if people want to look at it. It's, you know, it's obviously just like a very rough prototype, but I think it's helped me sort of figure out who's working on what, and who I should contact if I have a specific question. Jesus, I really wish I could talk more about this stuff, but like diversity is a huge, huge issue. I hope that we could just like have a session, a hackathon on this issue. Training and knowledge exchange. There's a lot of things that we're doing that other groups are also doing. And I'll say that this is something that I'm actively working on right now, talking more with many babies, many primates, other big team science groups, and exchanging resources so that we don't unnecessarily duplicate what we're working on. Okay, last few minutes here, I'll wrap it up. So when I think of this notion of a multiverse, I'm really awe-stricken by the many series of events that must have happened in order to bring us here today at PSACon. And I think that we have a unique origin story, but that there might be this sort of common thread that ultimately unites us. And so this is sort of my quick take on what that origin story might be. I think that most of us probably started studying psychology because we were curious about what makes people tick. Maybe we just wanted that knowledge for knowledge's sake. Maybe we wanted to make predictions about how people might behave tomorrow. Maybe we wanted to use this knowledge to build a better tomorrow. And then at some point, I think we started doing this big team science, and we realized that this is a tough job, that we can't answer complex questions with simple studies. And that seemingly small differences in how we operationalize our constructs, design our studies, sample our participants, analyze our data, have large multiplicative effects on the conclusions that we derive from our work. And these generalizability concerns, which I've sort of conceptualized in this multiverse problem idea, constrains the theories that we give to the people in our world, and constrains the predictions that we make, and it constrains the interventions that we recommend. So I think that's been happening. And I think that at some point, we probably learned that this work that we're trying to do might not have been well supported by the professional worlds that we sort of found ourselves in. And then I'm hoping that at some point we said, hey, there's something we can do about it. Let's come together and do big team science. So I think that this big team science movement that we're creating is one of the most promising developments in psychology right now. And I think that what we've done so far and what we're going to be doing over the next few days is really just one small step in what is hopefully going to be a much longer journey, a journey to sort of explore and address this difficult multiverse problem that constrains the generalizability of our work. This journey to build a better science, which I think is ultimately a journey to build a better world. So I want to just thank each and every one of you for, sort of joining us on this really important journey. And I want to thank the conference organizers for giving us a place to come together to kind of move this journey along. So I'll end there, but thank you everyone for coming, or for maybe you're listening to this offline. But thank you everyone. I hope everyone really enjoys the conference. I hope we're coming back again next year and the following year and the following year to continue to do this. Thank you everyone.